they're changing my voice. When I looked up the term sacred, I was surprised to find that every definition they displayed had to do with religion. It said pertaining to God, connected to God, having to do with religious doctrines, what have you. Sacred as opposed to secular. Keep in mind, this is a secular system whose fruits include, the fruits of this secular system include this definition, where they say that their system is not sacred. Now, sacred in a broad sense, right, includes things that are important, but they're superimposed on religious ideas. And anyone with any sense knows that religion ultimately comes from Africa. I remember having conversations with people who are so infected with Eurocentrism that they thought that martial arts and religion come from outside of Africa. Okay, they were that biased as a result of their cultural conditioning that they couldn't imagine that Africans forged their bodies, African warriors, through doing martial arts. Mind, body, soul, and spirit, right? Soul brothers. And not by playing basketball in the ancient world or something, And it's amazing how out of touch people are when it comes to black people, right? In terms of their true identity, right? When you think of black in America, you think African American. You think of jazz musicians, hip hop, rap, Obama. You just can't get it out of your mind. Okay? They don't want to admit that they're black because they came from Africa. And they say, well, that's different, that's African. And of course, to some degree, this is semantics. And so when we look at the word sacred, I tell you the truth. If it isn't the Royal African Falcon Martial Art Order, using their own definition from their Western site, the first definition that came up, then it isn't sacred. Think about it. Because for it to truly be sacred in a narrow sense, and narrow is the way to heaven, right? It has to be true. You can't say that something that someone just made up with psychology is sacred. So, they use the example of Hindu texts or something. That's something that somebody made up for that group of people. It might be important to them. Okay? Now, it's probably less and less important these days as globalism waters everything down, a bunch of narcissists, right? So on and so forth. But it isn't sacred in a narrow sense. Why? Now, listen carefully. No offense to Hindus, Indian people, very nice people, nice food, a lot of attractive women, a lot of, friendly people, very, very, very likable. But when we look at this idea, we have to ask ourselves, did people simply separate and come up with psychology to suit their people? Therefore, it's merely human rules, customs, and traditions to meet a need, be it psychological, be it a need for a social structure, for a caste system, for some kind of order, right? A perceived need. We have to ask ourselves that. Because everybody can't be right. If somebody worshipped, the moon or something, and someone said, no, the moon's not a god, that's just a planet, that's just a moon, rather. And and they said, well, God is greater than that. They're not both right. If somebody says that they don't believe that there is, God, and someone says that they do believe, they're not both right. And so it is with the idea of sacred. If someone says worshiping the one true God is right, is sacred, and worshiping a bunny rabbit is not, and someone says it the other way around, they're both not right. If someone says that a secular system that man made, and we've never seen a single secular system that isn't corrupt, mind you, is sacred. Okay, how could something that is corrupt be sacred, right? Not in a narrow sense. So we see when it comes to the nuances of the words, right, the specifics, we have to distinguish between what is actually sacred in reality and what is sacred in the minds of people who are in rebellion against what is sacred in reality. So if I say, it's a Royal African Falcon Martial Art Order, Fair. People come from Africa, right? Religion, right? Rejoin, reconnect. Reconnect to what? Okay, you got to, look at the evidence. How did it start? When did it begin? When did religion begin? Who was religious? What were they doing? Right? Why is it called a spirit? And some of the oldest religious artifacts on this planet were spearheads. When they found the python head in Africa that people worshipped, it was like 70,000 years ago. Now keep in mind, what are the odds that the first religion was people worshiping a python? It wasn't. It's just like in Egypt, some people worship snakes and Apep, and also called Apophis, and so on and so forth. And some people worship other things, lions, leopards, falcon, and they worshipped it relative to what they believed to be its spirit, its essence, right? Its place in the patterns in nature. So it's not quite the same as just worshiping an animal, mind you, and that's a very important distinction to make. And when people don't make that distinction, it's just like not making the distinction between what is actually sacred and what is man-made. And when we come to a multicultural place like America, and we see these pagan religions from all over the world, we see all these lying Christians and Muslims and Jews, no offense to anybody, this is just the situation. They themselves would argue that there's tons of those people who are lying. They would just disagree with me about how many of them there are that are lying. Okay. It is important to make that distinction. Why? Because we have to live under a common law, right? They say, don't speed. They decide whether prostitution is legal or not. Okay, they say don't kill and steal, and they define what is stealing. So when you don't look at the specifics effectively enough and where it matters most, you're doing a society a great injustice. And that goes back to that dishonor and that disgrace and that failure to be on the right side of the line between good and evil. Now, people in a secular system who started arguing a Neoplatonic philosophy when they said that they believe that evil magically doesn't exist. We're doing a great injustice. I've never met a single person who makes that argument that wouldn't care if they're being tortured while somebody is saying that evil doesn't exist, so quit complaining. But they think that they should be able to confuse society about the logical conclusion in regards to these matters, why the masses of the people suffer. And 9 million people starve to death a year, and 3 million of them children. That is criminal as it gets. All you have to offer is you do not acknowledge that good and evil exist. You offer no alternative, which feeds into the evil in this world. What there is a consensus about, for the most part, that is evil. And there's a few complete idiots that everyone laughs at, everyone with sense laughs at, who would argue that there's no evil. Unbelievable, right? To them, being what is good isn't sacred. That's part of why this video series is so important, because I make that distinction. I say this is what is honor, this is what is grace. That's what is dishonor. That's what is disgrace. And this is what is sacred. And that's what's profane. Feign, right? To fake. That's what's profane. If you have no viable counter argument for the Royal African Falcon Martial Art Order that is universal, then why should we live under your artificial, superficial, shallow, and stupid system instead of under the moral order of the Royal African Falcon Martial Art Order? We shouldn't. So why are we? Because what people think is sacred, for the most part, isn't. And what people need to know is sacred, they refuse to admit that it is. You see how important these words are? They point right to the problem. People don't have honor. They don't have grace. They don't understand what is sacred. They're not righteous or just or fair. They don't have valid relationships. They have disgraces. They don't have valid marriages. They have disgraces. And what else is a disgrace? Now, I don't want to break the rules on TikTok or something. Again, this is to teach religious teachings of good and evil, not to insult anybody. And in order to do that, I must make the distinction. If I speak generally, I may as well be worshiping the demons that are worshipped by other so-called religions. Because what will I have done? I'll have blurred the line. In order for me to point to myself as the valid Messiah, I must also effectively point everywhere that isn't valid and say that that isn't valid. And why? or else I'm not